The American government's tariffs, its trade war with China and the world has provoked a lot of speculation that we've come to the end of globalization. Keir Starmer's said it. The New York Times has said it. Even alternative media like the Duran have said it. Is it the end of globalization as we know it? Only if we focus on the last bit, as we know it. A lot of the talk about globalization, I think, is really fashionable nonsense. It doesn't really come to terms with a deeper history of what globalization has been, not just since the 1990s, but way, way back. When we say as we know it, we really mean globalization as from the 1990s, free trade, liberal economic policies, global economically focused institutions. It's a very economic, free trade oriented idea of globalization. But this is a very narrow policy, very narrow idea of globalization, and it's not really the way historians of globalization think about the term. Most notably, the great historian of empires and globalization, John Darwin. And in this video, I'm going to spell out to you 7 key assumptions that those quality historians of globalization use in thinking about globalization. That will help you think differently to the sort of fashionable nonsense out there about the end of globalization. And I will fill out what it means to say there was globalization in the world before 1990. And also I'll fill out the idea that globalization is much, much more than just a set of economic policies, a set of economic institutions of free trade. It's something that requires a lot more than a few Donald Trump tariff announcements to end. It's a very fundamental process in history. And finally, I'll have a little look at the way in which globalization may not be ending as we know it, rather what we have come to know as globalization is ending and a new kind of globalization is beginning. So first of all, let's spell out these key assumptions about the history of globalization. Now, I've done a number of videos on John Darwin's history, the after Tamerlane, the rise and fall of global empires, including one video where I very briefly discussed the different ideas of globalization historians have that most, mainstream and alternative media commentators have simply not quite come to terms with. But in this book by John Darwin called Unlocking the World, published in 2020, Port Cities and Globalization in the Age of Steam, he sets out really in one paragraph, just one paragraph, these key assumptions about the history of globalization that will help protect you from some of the, fashionable nonsense going on there and going around at the moment about the end of globalization. And I'm just going to spell out these 7 assumptions for you. So it's really crystal clear. And they're all, they're based on a lot of scholarship and a lot of knowledge of history, but they are all quite intuitive and easy to grasp. His work has, been based for decades in curiosity about the history of globalization. When he was working, it was all the rage from the 1990s, and he had a very deep look at the history of globalization to have a better understanding of it. And he says that his work is framed on several key assumptions. And the first of those is that our globalization, the globalization people are talking about when they're talking about the end of globalization, the globalization that Donald Trump attacks or populists attack and the New York Times mourns. Our globalization since 1990 is not unique, but only the latest in a series. One of those is the one he's talking about, steam globalization, the era of free trade, steamboats, railways, expanding empires, expanding global markets, even open-door trade policies in the United States in the latter part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. But there were previous eras of globalization, which I'll come to in a minute. The second key assumption is that we can best understand its distinctive features, that is globalization, by a knowledge of earlier versions. We come to know, I guess, globalization in the age of the internet and container shipping and flight and generally open cultural borders in a very different way to the age of globalization, in the age of European and American empires in the 19th century with steamboats and railways and machine guns. The third assumption is that globalizations are cumulative, but also subject to crises and reversals. We can feel the cumulative nature of globalizations in the texture of our lives. A cup of coffee, the spread of chilies from, South America to Asia and Eurasia, and even ultimately Australia. So many examples of these previous eras of globalisation, but they are cumulative. They don't really necessarily go away. The railway of the age of globalisation is still with us, but they add layers of relationships around the world. They can't just be abolished by a trade policy decision, and yet they can also experience shocks, crises, and sometimes change some of their processes, their reversals. The fourth assumption is that globalizations must be understood not as we tend to, as narrowly economic phenomena, but as the conjuncture of technological, commercial, cultural, ideological, geopolitical, and environmental change, all of which give them their distinctive character. And I'll say a little bit more about this later in the video, but it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Like, if you think about the nature of globalization since the 1990s, it is inseparable from the concept, I guess, of the World Wide Web. It's inseparable from the concept of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the ideological ascendancy of liberal democracy, including the hopes that even China might fall to liberal democracy one day. So all of these things are contained together, and change in every single one of those dimensions can change the character of globalization. It's not just what's happening in the financial markets, it's many other sources of change in the society. And then he adds, for what we exchange in globalization is not only goods, but also money, people, ideas, information, habits of consumption, and biota, plants, animals, and microbes. In a way, COVID was itself an experience of globalization, wasn't it? And similarly, the Columbian exchange, the exchange of plant materials like chilies and tomatoes and potatoes between the Americas and Eurasia and Africa, similarly was a huge exchange of biota as well as the exchange of diseases. And then he says it is through their complex interaction that the quality of each globalization is formed. It follows logically from this that the catalyst of globalization, its regulator, to use a term from STEAM technology, is mobility. The ease and speed with which things tangible and intangible can cross the wide spaces from one side of the world to the other. And so the quality of globalization might change with tariffs. Tariffs will change the speed and mobility, changes to reshoring and, building up supply chain networks in different parts of the world may change the character and mobility and directions and nature of globalization, but it will not end globalization. It may end globalization, however, as we know it, and particularly as the United States has come to know it. Now, a little bit later on in the book, he just spends about 2 pages really expanding on these ideas. And there's really 2 aspects of this little expansion that I want to break down for you, because I think it really helps to know, particularly his key assumption. If I can just go back to the way he articulated it, that our globalization is not unique. It is one of a series of previous globalizations which have had cumulative effects, that have had ups and downs, but have ultimately changed the world in very complex ways and across many layers of politics, economy and society and culture. And he emphasises this by commenting again that as a term, globalisation is most frequently used to describe the economic connectedness between different parts of the world that accelerated dramatically towards the end of the last century. That's how people are using it when they say the end of globalisation is nigh. But which he describes as the apparent hypermobility of goods, money, information and labour. As so often happens, it seemed at first to be a uniquely modern phenomenon, unprecedented and incomparable. A sense of perspective suggests the contrary, that our globalisation is merely the latest in a cumulative series of close encounters between distant parts of the globe. So what were these close encounters? Well, first of all, there's the first migration of Homo sapiens out of Africa to colonise Eurasia. Other colonisations followed. Aboriginal society spread across Australia from its northern coast some 45,000 years ago. The Americas were settled from Northeast Asia 15,000 years ago, probably in a series of coastal hops. And, of course, those led to further empires like the Aztecs and in the Amazon. Another interesting thing that perhaps too few people know, Madagascar, the island off the coast of Africa in the southern Indian Ocean, was colonised by settlers from the Indonesian archipelago in the first millennium BC. The extraordinary story of the navigation of Polynesian explorers and navigators who traversed the Pacific in their boats with their astonishing knowledge of navigation. They occupied all the habitable islands from Fiji to Easter Island, from the Hawaiian Islands, now part of America, to New Zealand in an astonishing series of voyages from around 1000 BC to 1250 AD. The last of those, of course, being New Zealand. Similarly, there's been long-distance trade networks in the Bronze Age from 3000 BC to 1000 BC. the emergence of mega empires like Neo-Assyrian, Achaemenid, Hellenistic, Mauryan in India, Han and Roman, which had long-distance commerce arrangements across most of Eurasia. There has been the conditions of globalisation for millennia, not just since 1990. That's not going to end anytime soon. So this is why it's really important to think of globalisation as more than just an economic phenomenon, more than just neoliberalism or a set of trade policies associated with a bunch of, political hacks since the 1990s. Globalisation, he writes, is best understood as the long-distance exchange of people, goods, monies, technology, ideas, beliefs, and biota, animals, plants, and less visibly, microbes. An example is the Columbian exchange, the exchange of, plant life, all the things that are regular parts of the diet of people all around the world. Potatoes, tomatoes, chilies, all sorts of things in the Columbian exchange. But so too is the Mongol exchange, as I discussed in my interview with Marie Favreau, who wrote The History, the Horde, how the Mongols changed the world, the extraordinary cross-Eurasian into Africa, into what we think of as Europe, exchange and trade networks, diplomatic and cultural understanding, religious networks that were developed through the Mongol empires and subsequent successor states, the various horde states. Similarly, there's the example of Columbus and the sort of free trade globalization of the 19th century, which too had a whole set of cultural connections, an idea of civilization, an idea of race superiority, an idea of the supremacy of the West. And here it is essential that he emphasises that globalisation is more than economics, more than economic policy. It must be understood as something wider and more complex than merely new patterns of trade. They embodied, in fact, a new set of cultural, demographic, geopolitical and ecological relations, as well as those that were shaped by technology and commerce. Indeed, it's often more the consumer preferences of the cultural preferences of consumers, the distribution of populations, the physical power to force open markets, and the ease of different natural environments being, adapted to human needs that shapes the growth of technology and commerce rather than the other way around. The history of globalisation must be sought in the intricate interplay between these various components and in the conjunctures they formed in different parts of the world. Global connectedness has always been uneven and remains so today, favouring now one region, now another, constantly creating new cores and peripheries and shifting the balance of power, wealth and cultural self-confidence across the continents. So in this context, when you hear people talk about the end of globalisation, think instead that there has been a change in the quality of globalisation, a change in the balance of power and cultural self-confidence of different regions around the world. Nothing speaks a lack of cultural self-confidence so much as Donald Trump's slapping 100% plus tariffs on China. I think what we're seeing is not the end of globalisation. What we're seeing is a change in the direction and the quality and the nature of globalisation. Globalisation no longer just comes from the West. Globalization is the exchange of all those other ideas and people and information from outside of the West that is no longer the dominant set of powers in the world. It's changing our world. Globalization is, the tides of globalization have changed. Globalization now has multipolar characteristics. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to know more about the real history of the changing world after 1945, do become a paid subscriber at jeffrich.substack.com, and you'll get my real history guide to the post-1945 world, based on the brilliant work of the historian John Darwin in his book After Tamerlane. Thanks so much for watching.